What is the everlasting gospel? Turn with me, please, to Revelation chapter 14, verse 6. Revelation 14, verse 6. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. Notice that the gospel that is described there is the everlasting gospel. We want to understand what that is. Turn with me to Matthew 24, verse 14. Now, as context, we are looking at the period of time that is the 70th week. Let's look at Matthew 24, verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. We know that during the 70th week, the kingdom church preaches the gospel of the kingdom. Matthew 24:14 specifically tells us that. Let's next get Acts chapter 10, verse 28. Acts chapter 10 and verse 28. And he said unto them, Ye know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. But God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Acts 10:28 is a very helpful verse. Acts 10 is a long time after Matthew 28. Matthew 28, the so-called Great Commission, has the 12 going to all nations. Well, Acts 10 helps explain how to understand that commission. Peter says as late as Acts 10 that it is unlawful for a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. What that tells you is the Matthew 28 commission was not to preach the kingdom gospel to Gentiles, because in Acts 10, Peter specifically says that he wouldn't do that. Instead, the Matthew 28 commission was to go to Jews scattered among the Gentiles. If you think about what happened in the Old Testament, one of God's judgments upon Israel and Judah was that they were to be scattered among the nations of the world. Now go back with me, if you would, to Revelation 14, verse 6. Revelation 14, verse 6. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, now notice this, to preach unto them that dwell on the earth. It's not just Jews. And to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. The everlasting gospel clearly includes Gentiles. It's thus different from the kingdom gospel. In Revelation 14:6, it doesn't simply say to go to all nations, but it talks about every kindred, every tongue. It talks about them that dwell on the earth. In other words, this is broader than just Jews. This everlasting gospel that's described in Revelation 14:6 is a gospel that is going to be preached unto Gentiles. Now notice verse 7. So Revelation 14, verse 7. Saying with a loud voice. Here is the description of the content of the everlasting gospel. Fear God and give glory to him. For the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. Revelation 14:6 refers to the everlasting gospel. Verse 7 defines what the everlasting gospel is. It's fear God and give glory to him. Now, when you think of that description, it may remind you of an Old Testament verse. Turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon writes something that is very similar to the everlasting gospel. What he says is the whole duty of man, not just Israel, is to fear God and keep his commandments. What I'll suggest to you is this. The everlasting gospel is called the everlasting gospel because it is timeless, meaning wherever someone is on the timeline, what should they always do? They should always fear God, and they should keep his commandments. There's never a time anywhere on the dispensational chart where man shouldn't fear God and keep his commandments, where man shouldn't fear God and give glory unto him. That is why it is described as the everlasting gospel. It's timeless. It's always the case. Let me show you some additional verses on that. Get Psalm 111, verse 10. Psalm 111, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Proverbs 1, 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 9, verse 10. Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, people sometimes think, well, those verses on the fear of the Lord that are in Proverbs, that was for back then, and those don't really apply today during the dispensation of grace. Get 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. Here's a verse that people often quote, and I think they're misapplying it. 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And so some will say, well, we shouldn't have the fear of God today because God hath not given us a spirit of fear. So we shouldn't fear God. I'll tell you that's not what the verse is saying. What 2 Timothy 1 verse 7 is saying is not to have the fear of man. 2 Timothy 1 is not saying not to have the fear of God. Now you say, well, how do you know that? Look with me at Romans chapter 3, verse 18. Romans 3, verse 18. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And in the context, that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. Get 2 Corinthians 5, verse 11. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 11. Paul says, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord. Paul himself knew and had the terror of the Lord. Get with me 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. 2 Corinthians 7, verse 1. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Paul's saying that they ought to have the fear of God. Get Ephesians 5, verse 21. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 21. Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Paul's saying they ought to have the fear of God. Colossians 3:22. Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. What do all of those verses tell us? Should someone during the dispensation of grace have the fear of God? Clearly the answer is yes. Even a believer should have the fear of God. Having the fear of God is a timeless truth. It doesn't matter where you are on the dispensational chart, you ought to have the fear of God. So what then is the everlasting gospel described in Revelation 14? Well, it's obvious what it is. The everlasting gospel is the same thing that Solomon described as the whole duty of man. It is something that is true across all dispensations. Man should fear God and give him glory. Man should fear God and keep his commandments, whatever dispensation, whatever time period he happens to be living in.